So first of all, I'm delighted to be here tonight and to, as Mariano said, I recently joined IAAC and I'm very happy to bring tonight to you and to IAAC this topic and this presentation titled Governing 24-Hour Cities, Time as a New Urban Frontier. And today's lecture is meant to be not only an invitation, but also a provocation, because I want to encourage you to become interested in the urban governance perspective from a new light. And nighttime governance is a topic that for me began 12 years ago, and it began as a hobby. However, before I started studying nighttime governance at the GSD and through my doctoral studies, I began doing research around this topic in Caracas, Venezuela with a friend. We started walking around different areas of the city of Caracas at night, like Boulevard Sabana Grande, which is a large commercial boulevard, around metro stations, shopping malls, and trying to understand how urban dynamics, how pedestrian flows, how different activities change at night. And we discovered a field. We discovered that nighttime planning and night studies were actually a field that was emerging in many parts of the world, from the UK to Australia to Germany and France, but that was absent in most urban planning studies, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's interesting to see how these dynamics that I was referring to, the ones that I was studying with my friend, are actually, they point to an indication that time like space, just like space, is a key aspect when planning cities. When we think about a space, such as a basic space, such as a bench in a public area, such as a park or a plaza, a bench has different uses throughout the 24-hour cycle. However, unfortunately, until very recently, we have forgotten to think about how the night has to be planned. We've been very reactive when it comes to planning the city at night, and we forget that that density is a very diverse concept. When we analyze cities in temporal terms, we realize that density is a dynamic concept. And one of my favorite examples to illustrate this dynamism is particularly the central square of Marrakesh in Morocco, which is interesting. I don't know if you've been there, but during the day, it is a transition space. It's a transit space. So people who walk from outside of the Medina into the Medina, they transit around here, they can buy orange juice, they can walk into the souks. But at night, it experiences a massive transformation. In just a few minutes, you can see how all these food stalls, performers appear, and the area becomes transformed into a nighttime marketplace. And this is what I was pointing out before, like the bench in that square, in that plaza. Spaces in cities are dynamic. Density is dynamic, and it has a temporal aspect. So that's what I want to talk to you about, how we think about the 24-hour cycle, and we think about cities, not only from the spatial perspective, but also from the temporal perspective. And to think about this, to think in temporal terms, it's important to realize that there's several definitions here in place. On one hand is a daytime economy, there's a nighttime economy, there's a 24-hour economy, and there's a network of support services and institutions that function in the city. When we talk about the nighttime economy, and this is a functional definition that has become pretty standardized internationally, we talk about all productive activities that take place between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And of course, there's different like seasonal differences or cultural differences, regional differences, but we've been using this definition. And when I say we, it's the international community studying the city at night. We've come to use 6 to 6 as a metric in order to understand what belongs or what's part of the nighttime economy. But then we also have the 24-hour economy. And it's important to understand that it's a broader container that incorporates the nighttime economy, and that both definitions have both a production and a consumption side. We're not only talking about people who go out at night to party, to enjoy for leisure activities, but also people who work at night and all the services that operate around the clock in cities. And this is what I was referring to as a field of night studies. These are some of the contributions that have been emerging over the past 15 years. It's a field that has been growing very, very fast. And it's interesting to see how, well, most of these contributions, as you can see, one first limitation is that they're mostly in English. There's only a few that have emerged in Spanish, in French, in German. But this literature is definitely growing, and there's more and more academics, more and more institutions getting involved in studying cities at night. And another important limitation and an interesting space for opportunity is that only few of these studies look at the night from an urban planning or from an urban or design perspective. And because most of these publications, these literature, looks at the night from a social perspective, looks at the night from a sociological perspective, from the criminology perspective, but there's tons of space of opportunity to understand, as I was saying before, not only the spatial dimension of planning, but also the temporal one, and the night as a space of opportunity. But another limitation that has existed when it comes to the field of night studies is that the night has unfortunately been seen as a space that is negative in essence, that is negative, that needs to be regulated, that needs to be restricted, as a problem, because we often see in newspapers, we see in different spaces how there's negative externalities associated to the night. So more noise, more crime, more conflict, and we need to solve that problem by reducing nighttime activity. But I want to invite you, as I said, this is a provocation and an invitation to see the night as a space of opportunity, and to understand that the night is a broad ecosystem of actors that not only touches on data and information from entertainment and culture, but also from different services, from healthcare, from economic development. And speaking of economic development, a very important aspect to think about when we think about the night is what are its contributions from an economic perspective? And this is in terms of economic impact. Many cities like London, New York, and Sydney have conducted economic impact studies to measure their nighttime economies. We can see that they're large, they're impossible to ignore. It's millions of people who work at night in different sectors, not only nightlife and culture, but also in healthcare. It supports many jobs, generates tons of revenue. So having this context in mind, I want to structure this presentation into 4 main sections. The first will be 4 myths of nighttime management, because as I said before, the night unfortunately has this negative connotation. So I will debunk some of these myths with you first, so you get a sense of what this field is about. Second, I will tell you what is nighttime governance, what's this concept, how it emerged, and some examples from different countries. Then I will talk briefly about the night and how it was interrupted during the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, how a collaborative approach, a collaborative governance approach should be used to manage cities after dark. So to begin, nighttime management. As I said, there's several myths around managing the city at night. And the first of them is that shorter nights are better nights. And it's common to hear that when there's a problem, when something happens at night, the solution is curfew. We have to close everything, reduce operating hours because, less hours is better. There's two main types of policies that relate to nighttime planning. On one hand, there's those that establish that to enhance activity in cities, we need to reduce nighttime activity. We need to reduce the hours of operation. That way we can reduce those negative externalities I was talking about before, such as noise, such as conflict. But on the other hand, we also have others who believe that the solution is not to reduce, but to expand nighttime economy, to open it up to the 24-hour cycle. And what's really interesting is that there's these two sides of the coin sometimes happen even in the same city. It's what I like to call the pendulum effect, because sometimes even the same city will be we'll go from a curfew to close everything, like it happened in Sydney with the so-called lockdown laws they happened after a couple of young men died in a nighttime event. The city closed everything down, and then Sydney's moving all to the opposite side of the spectrum, promoting a nighttime expansion strategy. What is interesting to see here is that one of the tendency, the trend that we're seeing now in our cities is that they're moving more and more towards the second side of the coin, towards the expansion of nighttime activity. And this is the case of cities like Amsterdam. And I like to bring this example, which is a little bit old, but it's still relevant. It's one of the first 24-hour licenses that were granted in Amsterdam. You might be wondering, what do you mean by 24-hour licenses? So Amsterdam is a city that, as if you've visited the city, you've seen that most of its nightlife is concentrated in the center. It's very dense, like Barcelona. It's pretty chaotic at night. So what the city did a few years ago was to establish a new type of liquor license, which is 24-hour license. For venues and establishments the first condition is that they have to be outside of the city center, because the idea is to decongest the center. And they have to have some sort of creative cultural agenda. And in this case, this particular venue, it's called The School, and it was a former school that was repurposed and reused as during the day as a restaurant, as a cafe, and at night as a venue. The power and the potential behind this is not only reutilizing buildings in the city throughout the 24-hour cycle, but also promoting new areas, new hubs of activity outside of the city center by creating this 24-hour licenses. This was a pilot that started several years ago and has grown significantly. And here you can see, so these are different examples of 24-hour policies. So one is Amsterdam, as I mentioned. This year, the city granted additional 24-hour licenses. Also, cities like Montreal are experimenting with this model. And more recently, London, the city of London, has created something called the nighttime enterprise zones, which is basically an experimental approach to around high streets or around commercial streets to enable hours of operation to expand for certain areas of the city. And they get special funding and support from the administration in order to become more 24 hours. So as you can see, this is a new trend towards expanding nighttime activity in different cities around the world. A second myth is that more police equals more safety. And this is key because when we think about cities at night, often the image we have from, again, newspapers, the TV, movies is the police, is chaos, is conflict. However, this couldn't be further from the truth because in recent years, we've seen the emergence of a broader cast of actors that are getting involved in managing cities at night. And this refers to trade organizations, to best practice schemes and accreditations, to square guardians or hosts, and to local pacts or agreements. Some examples just to illustrate this concept is the famous concept of the square hosts or ambassadors that has emerged in cities like London on the left. These are the square hosts from Soho Angels. In the center is Le Pierrot de la Nuit, which are in Paris. This group of performers, actors that guide patrons who leave bars and restaurants in mixed use areas at night and ask them to quietly do so they don't disturb people who are sleeping. And then you have on the right, the Amsterdam Square hosts who have been deployed in areas such as Rembrandtplein, which are highly saturated, highly concentrated in terms of nightlife activity. And the idea is that these groups, what they have in common is that they're they're closer to people than the police. Sometimes when you see a policeman at night, for some people, it intimidates them, it pushes them away. So when you see civic actors, people approach them more easily when they have a problem, when they're at night and they can't find their friends, when they have no battery on their phones. These people, what they do is they mediate, they identify issues or potential issues, and they report them to the police. So there's a more efficient use of the police. So people are not calling the police because there's noise or there's a small fight. So the police is only there as a last resort when it comes to managing nighttime areas. And this is another example of, in this case, of an agreement that was created for Jungbusch, which is an area creative district in the city of Mannheim in Germany. This is an example of how specific neighborhoods that have a creative vocation or nightlife areas create specific agreements that are written in collaboration between residents and nightlife businesses to then reach some sort of rules or transparency in terms of how to govern or how to manage an area at night. Because imagine if you have a very highly concentrated area with bars and restaurants, but also with residents, how do you reach some consensus or some at least common ground when it comes to how to manage the city at night? A third myth has to do with thinking that nighttime equals party time, that nighttime is necessarily related to leisure and entertainment, bars, restaurant, clubs. Although I've been talking a little bit about bars, restaurant, clubs, and nightlife, I also want to invite you to think about the night as a space for other kinds of activities. And I like to bring this image that comes from Cali in Colombia. I was involved in putting together the strategy, the 24-hour Cali strategy a few years ago, which was to create a nighttime mayor for the city. I'll talk about this later. And at the time, the city did a survey and they asked its residents, what kinds of activities do you do at night outside of your house? And it was surprising to find that 52% of people said they wanted to do sports. They practice sports at night. So the night is not only a space for leisure, but also a space for leisure related to nightlife per se, but also other kinds of of leisure, such as sports. And also other kinds of industries and sectors, such as, of course, healthcare, all the caregiving industries, logistics, and call centers that are proliferating in many cities around the world. And finally, the fourth myth is that nightlife equals or is always a synonym of nuisance. And here we have to think about zoning. So from a planning perspective, when we think about zoning, the traditional zoning or the separation of uses in the city, the very strict separation of uses in the city, always established that entertainment had to be segregated. So we had to put everything that had to do with the night in a separate box, in a separate area. And this has led to the emergence of, in many places around the world, of fake and artificial entertainment districts that have very specific conditions that during the day, in most cases, are closed, but at night they become alive, that have special regulations, that have special characteristics. But the reality is that we cannot separate uses anymore. We live in a world and we live in cities that are becoming more compact. We want to make cities more sustainable. We want to integrate uses in a more coherent way. So we cannot segregate nightlife anymore. So what do we do? And one of the things that we've been seeing is that there is tension. There's constant tension in many cities. And this picture was taken by my parents. I used to live in Austin, Texas for a while. And it's funny how in a street like this, this is a bar that I went to several times. And a few months later, my parents sent me this picture and said, hey, look, this bar now has a residential building right next to it. It's completely surrounded by the residential building. And it's interesting because there's a very tight connection between nightlife and gentrification. So I don't know if you think about places like Brooklyn in New York, or you think about places in many cities, in Amsterdam, in Berlin, in Barcelona, there's many clear examples of neighborhoods that were in the transition, like post-industrial neighborhoods that with nightlife, or through nightlife, it became revitalized, and then they attracted new residents. And as soon as the residents moved in, they forgot about the reasons why they moved there in the first place. So they start complaining, and then nightlife gets kicked out. It's a cycle, and it's the gentrification of nightlife. It's called that way. And it's what this picture to some extent illustrates. What's the problem here? The problem here is that as neighbors complain, there's pressure over the venues, and there's this dynamics, tensions that create many pressures in cities around the world. And there's a phenomenon that actually has a name. In Germany, it's called Clubsterben. Oh, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but it's the death of clubs. Basically, in Germany, they have been taking a toll on the number of clubs and places, venues that have been disappearing over the past many years, as well as in the UK. This picture, which is a study done by Nesta a few years ago. It's before, I wanted to use an older study because it's pre-COVID. I'll talk about COVID later. This shows how in a matter of 10 years, many clubs in the city of London disappeared, and you can see them. So the orange dots are the clubs that were open, and then the purple ones on the 2015 side are the ones that closed. Many of them disappeared. There's many factors behind this: gentrification, rising rents, all kinds of social and economic factors. However, this is happening in many places around the world, and it's connected to what I was saying before. So keep this in your mind. This tension between residents and nighttime activity, not only nightlife, but also other kinds of nighttime activity, has always existing, and it's becoming more and more prominent as our cities gravitate towards more compact and mixed use environments. What can we do about this? So in Germany, speaking of Germany, one of the solutions has been to designate nighttime venues such as clubs as cultural venues, even to have to tax them in the same way as cultural venues. And in other places, there's something called the agent of change, which is a regulation that establishes that whoever appears later is the agent of change. So in the case of the Austin bar, the agent of change is the building, the residential building. So that residential building must assume all the costs that come with soundproofing or adapting its infrastructure so the club can survive. These are just some ideas of the solutions that exist. But beyond the brick and mortar and beyond the built environment, there's also an interesting thing, which is that festivals that also relate to nighttime and culture have also become a very important aspect of city planning. And they even call the attention of Paul Romer, the Nobel laureate. And he went to see the site of Burning Man in 2019, and he asked a question: what can we learn from festivals when we plan cities? because it's really interesting. If you think about it, festivals are temporal agglomerations. People follow specific rules. They're organized in specific ways, and everything happens harmoniously to a certain extent. So what can we learn from a festival environment? And we bring this to urban planning. And when we go, actually, we don't have to go too far to, theorize too much. It's actually happening. It's been happening in Amsterdam for a while. It's the so-called festival approach to nighttime planning. And when I was doing my research for my doctoral dissertation, I was in Amsterdam. I had the opportunity to interview people from the DSP group, which is a policy group in Amsterdam. And they explained to me that the festival approach refers to curating the experience of a city at night, in this case, as meticulously as you would curate a festival. So here in the case of Amsterdam, you have the 3 main nightlife districts. And what they did was to take these districts and to connect them by using wayfinding, by using lighting, and by using different resources, just as like they would curate a festival. And these are some images that describe how this was done. So it's interesting how there's some basic principles can be translated from one environment to the other. And in this case, how, as you can see, nighttime activity or nightlife not only creates problems, but also could, provide some solutions when it comes to innovating in nighttime planning. And then we reach the topic of governance. And I'd like to share some concepts on what this is, because this is a topic that has emerged only a few years ago. And when we think about governance, what is governance? Governance is basically the agreement, the collaboration between a number of actors towards a collective good. And in the case of nighttime governance, it's exactly the same, but applied to, of course, the night. So in this case, as we saw before, beyond the police, there have been new actors getting involved in managing cities at night. And these cast of actors is becoming broader and broader. And nighttime governance refers to understanding the relationships between these actors and how they're shaping urban environments around the world. A few years ago, you could see this all the time in so many newspapers and in Twitter and Instagram, all kinds of headlines about night mayors and night czars and the maire de la nuit, and all kinds of ambassadors that were popping up in many cities around the world. And a lot of buzz was happening around this term. But what is a night mayor? And what is a night mayor? And how has this term evolved over the past several years? Essentially, night mayors or ambassadors or czars or hosts, they have different names, are mediators between 3 groups. On one hand, you have local authorities or local governments. You have the residents who want to sleep and who want safety. And you have the nighttime economy. So you have operators, you have owners of bars and restaurants. So night mayors are articulating different needs. They are translators of different agendas within these different groups. And one thing that I did when I was doing my doctoral studies was conduct a study to understand what night mayors were, to understand how this phenomenon was coming to be, and to get a sense of the demographics behind it, the responsibilities of these people, the resources they had, the scope, and the preliminary contributions. And I did this study, I conducted it with Merrick Milan, who's the founder of Vibe Lab, an international consulting company on nighttime planning. And Merrick and I conducted this survey. We distributed it online to 45 individuals who were night mayors or ambassadors around the world. And we asked them a set of questions. And this led to a publication of a paper. It was published in Urban Studies in 2020, and it was the first paper to describe this phenomenon of night mayors around the world. But I'll share some findings. Essentially, in terms of demographics, it's not a surprise that most of these people who are night mayors are young people. They're between 35 and 45 years old, and most of them initially were men. This is changing gradually. In terms of resources to operate this role, in the beginning, they had very little money. They had around $20,000 as a budget to operate as a night mayor. And then they also had little staff or no staff at all. We're talking about individuals responsible for managing a city at night. That's like a very broad responsibility and a very broad mandate for one person, don't you think? And then in terms of the future, one main question that popped up when we were doing this study back in 2018 was, so are these night mayors here to stay? Or is this just a trend that is like a popular thing, a sexy thing that is coming up everywhere? And so we asked the question, what's going to happen when the mayor who appointed this night mayor changes? Because what happened in cities like New York or like London is that the mayor of the city created this role, created the night mayor role. And the question is, what happens when there's a mayoral change? But we've seen some permanence in many of the cities that have appointed these positions. And one of the main contributions of this paper was that we produced this map, which basically identified all the night mayor offices and ambassadors around the world. And we even put together a timeline to see how more and more cities were joining this trend through the years. But this is not a static, this is just a picture of a moment. This is changing constantly. So we, with Vibe Lab, we decided to put it online. So if you go to nighttime.org/map, you can actually click on the cities and you can see the names of each office, what kind of night mayor it is, because there's different types. There's internal night mayors, those that are situated within city government. There's external ones or independent ambassadors. And there's also boards, commissions, councils that are popping up everywhere. So if you visit this site, you can check out all these different variations. And this points to the typology. So we also identified that there were some types of night mayors. So either independent advocates that had temporary appointments, which is the case of Berlin or the case of Amsterdam, which were commissions or organizations that were nonprofits that operated for a moment of time, but then disappeared or dissolved. And then in the case of, like as I mentioned, New York, London, and some cities in Latin America, in Australia, they are more official or permanent representatives that have permanent positions. But we're seeing in more recent years, there's a third type of night mayors or nighttime governance institutions that is popping up, which is councils, commissions, advisory committees. And in some cases, some cities even have a combination of these. For instance, in Paris. In Paris, there is a permanent role, is a deputy mayor that is responsible for the night. And then there's also a commission that meets twice a year and involves people from nighttime economies, residents, harm reduction groups, and they come together to discuss pressing issues for the city. So it's interesting how there's a universe of nighttime governance institutions. It's a new field. More and more people are getting involved in studying this and understanding what kinds of models cities should have, what model works better in one situation than in another. And it's really interesting to see that, and it's very important to say that here I'm not saying that all cities should have night mayors. This is not the message I want you to leave with. The idea is that each city should think about if they need or not a model and what kind of model would suit better their institutional trajectory, their regulatory history, to figure out if it's good or bad for them. And then moving into, so from collaborative governance is a very important tool to look at cities at night, because as I said before, tension at night is a key word. There's always conflict, there's always tension, there's always this negative externality. So how do we solve issues at night in a collaborative way? And here I'm going to share a few examples of projects that I've done, most of them through Nighttime, which is the company that I started after I completed my doctoral studies. And a very important premise of these projects is basically understanding this ecosystem of actors, how there's different actors in a city that have different agendas, and how do we bring them all together in a cohesive and in a coherent way. So we have residents on one hand who care about their safety and they care about having less noise at night so they can sleep. We have nightlife, which is basically but you can hear me well, right? Okay. Nightlife is the second actor, which is basically nighttime economy. So owners of restaurants, of bars, of venues that operate at night, they want clearer rules, they want regulations that benefit their businesses, and they want greater income, of course, because they're business people. Then there's the youth who want more affordable options to activities to go out at night, whether it is sports at night, whether it is cultural options at night, but they have to be more affordable. And then you have local governments who want to promote more inclusive and productive uses of public spaces. And then in the end, this all comes together with this idea of a nighttime ride to the city. We all have different interests, we all have different agendas, but we have to agree on something so we can have a shared vision from which we can build on. And under this premise, many cities have started different projects, interesting collaborations, and this is the case of New York City. So New York City has, since 2018, they have the Office of Nightlife, which is basically an executive office created by the mayor that is within the organizational structure of the city of New York. And it has an executive director, which is sometimes called the night mayor. Her name is Ariel Palitz, and she's the woman in the podium. And here in this picture, you can see something really interesting, which is you have a night mayor, but you also have sitting in that table a group of agencies. You have the police, you have firemen, you have cultural services, planning department, and they're there to discuss how their different departments intersect at night. And this hadn't happened before in the history of New York City until 2018. It's crazy. Like it was a blind spot for cities. Nobody was talking about how we all have to care about the night. It was just ignored. And in this case, this image is from something that was called the 5-borough tour. So the city of New York, when they started this office, they said, okay, first we need to listen to what people need. We need to go to the 5 boroughs of New York, and we need to talk to residents, to venue owners, to community boards, and understand what they want, what they need for the city at night. And more or less around that premise is that I've been building this methodology to work with cities that I have used in several places, such as Valparaiso. And I'm bringing this example so you understand how it has been implemented. So Valparaiso, I don't know if you know about the city. It's a fascinating city. It's small, but it's unique in the sense that it was one of the major ports in the Pacific until the Panama Canal existed, because the ships had to go all the way south and then up, and they stopped in Valparaiso before going north because of the gold rush. So the city has had a bustling port and all these sailors coming from all over the world, and amazing nightlife and cabarets and bars. And the city, because of that history, was designated by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. But the site has been in danger, has been in the danger list for a long time. Part of the reason for this is because of issues at night. And the problem is that Valparaiso is a city that's beautiful, but it has a very complicated topography. It's uphill, it's hills, it's intricate streets, and residents live very close to each other. And you have a very large university population that parties in public squares at night, and they drink outside. So it's chaos, it's tension, as I was mentioning before. So they called me, and this was a project I did with the IDB, with the Inter-American Development Bank, and they told me, so how can we characterize the city, the World Heritage Site of Valparaiso at night? How can we understand its relationship day to night? And how can we solve these issues, these tensions that exist here? And I said, well, I don't know, but let's ask its people. Let's ask the people first to see what they have to say. So that's what we did. And we implemented several methods in this case. And in this case, well, we did focus groups involving those 4 groups that I mentioned before. So residents, nighttime economy, local authorities, and young people as well in a separate group, because sometimes youth is the hardest group to convene in these meetings. They're harder to get into a room. And then we also did, I used spatial methods in this case. I mapped, you can see in this map, the purple spots, or the buildings marked in purple, are those that have liquor licenses. And then you can see in the different shades of brown, you can see its residential uses. So in this case, and it's interesting how only few cities are actually mapping their nighttime activity. We don't even know what's the relationship between residential uses and entertainment uses. We don't even know what's the proximity between 2 liquor licenses, or what's the impact that has in real life, or what's the proximity between liquor licenses and hospitals and schools. There are regulations and zoning codes that establish there has to be a minimum distance between liquor licenses, but they are obsolete, most of them. They come from the early 20th century, and they don't take into account real impact. So just putting everything into a map and then contrasting that information with conversations with real people was a really interesting method to understand what Valparaiso should do to put together a nighttime governance strategy, and what kind of actions the city could take. And one important concept that I want to share with you is the idea of nighttime heritage, because when we think about heritage, and the example from Berlin is interesting in this same direction. Heritage is not only tangible, it's also intangible, of course. And in the case of nightlife, many venues and establishments that are part of our cities tell the story of our cities. And if we allow them to disappear, then we lose part of the history. In this case, this is a bar that exists in Valparaiso. It's from 1908. And with this project, we identified different venues and different places that are part of Valparaiso's nighttime heritage. Every city has this. Here in Barcelona, you can go to Marsella or Canculleretas. You can go to different bars that are years and years old, and they tell the story of the city. So recognizing this impact is really important. And finally, the night was interrupted for a period of time, and it's impossible not to give a lecture about nighttime activity and nighttime planning without even mentioning the pandemic, because the pandemic had a massive impact on nighttime ecosystems, the largest in the case of the US, the largest since the prohibition. In many places around the world, it was the first halt in many, many years. And one image that always came, what was always used in our circles was nighthawks, hovers, nighthawks, and how basically the lights came out. The lights went out, and all these curfews and all these very strict measures for social distancing just put a halt on nighttime economies, and everything just ended for a couple of years. But what's the impact of this on what I just told you before? What's the impact on nighttime heritage? What's the impact on nighttime governance? What's the impact on nuisance and tensions? How did this change the way we experience cities after dark? It's, as well, as I mentioned, this was really, really big and significant. We all know this. For the first time ever, New York City stopped its subway. Its subway has always been 24 hours. For the first time, it stopped. In Berlin, a city that never had a curfew since 1949, had a curfew for the first time during the pandemic. So it was significant. But I want to share with you the positive outcome of all this. So I like this quote from Jane Jacobs, which is basically relating to how cities can, they have marvelous innate abilities for understanding, communicating, contriving, and inventing what is required to combat their difficulties. And that's what basically most of these nighttime ecosystems did. And we like to talk about the term nighttime resilience, which is there was a resiliency in all this. And there's examples that come from places like New York. And this in the picture is Ariel Palitz, the executive director of the Office of Nightlife in New York, or the night mayor. And cities like New York were one of the hardest hit during the pandemic, and they came up immediately with strategies to contain the problem, to protect jobs, to save lives, and but also to allow people to coexist. Because one of the hardest aspects of all of this was that we cannot stop our urge and our need to socialize. And one important aspect of the night is that the night is the quintessential space to meet others and to socialize. It's the leisure, is the aspect, the nice part of the day when we stop working. So if we forget about the night, if we kill the night, then we are killing a part of ourselves. And one thing that also was happening in many places was the recognition that stopping nighttime activity with a curfew doesn't really put a stop on the activity at all. It creates, it enables, or it provokes informal activities, informal gatherings that became super spreader events all around the world. And in the picture on the left, it's from New York City in the middle. I took this picture in the middle of the winter in 2020, how programs like open restaurants in New York, because of flexible sidewalk uses and because of flexible regulations around alcohol, allowed new business models to emerge. So it's interesting to see how not everything was lost. New business models emerged, new preferences emerged. And also new communities emerged. And this is a picture from promoted and fostered by VibeLab, which is this consultancy that I mentioned before, the one that did the map. Many conversations started happening online. So experts, activists, night mayors, suddenly there was a WhatsApp group with 100 night mayors from around the world talking to each other. What's happening in Tallinn? What's happening in London? What's happening in Bogota? And it was really interesting how these conversations led to crafting solutions. So we created, as a network, we created the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan, which I also invite you to check out if you want on nighttime.org. And this is basically a compilation of experiences, of case studies, of innovative solutions that cities came up with during the pandemic in order to solve what was happening in terms of the night. And then I'm going to end this presentation talking a little bit about Barcelona, because this is where we are right now. And this is the city that, although I've been here only for a little while, for a year and a half, I had the privilege this year of working on a project with El Ayuntamiento de Barcelona and with Eden City to think about its nighttime vision. And I want to use this example to also finish my invitation to you to think about the night in more open ways. So one of the challenges with Barcelona, and the ones who are here know this, is that it's such a dense city. It's one of the densest cities in Europe, which makes coexisting at night very difficult. And particularly since the city it's a combination, it's a mix of uses, and it's active in during many hours of the day. And this is a picture from my friend Greta, who's in the audience. And these are real images of botellones during the pandemic. So if you were here during the pandemic, this was happening all over the city. People gathering at night because, as I mentioned before, you cannot stop people from gathering. It's a natural thing. It's a human thing. So how do you solve this problem if some people want to sleep and some people want to gather? And one of the solutions that came out of this, and one of the things that the Ayuntamiento did in this case, was creating its own nighttime governance institution, which is called La Taula Ciudadana per una nit cívica y segura, which is a board that promotes a safe and civic night. And it encompasses the 4 groups that I've been mentioning on and on. So the residents, the local authorities, including the police, youth groups, nighttime economy, different commissions, Comisión Nocturna. And it's really a combination of all these actors that came together and started having these meetings to discuss how to solve this issue, as the city was seeing that the preferences were changing, tourism was coming back. And during the pandemic, many venues in Barcelona closed their doors. Fecalon estimates that around 200 establishments were lost over the past 3 decades, which means that there's around 100,000 people at night. That's like floating population that have nowhere to go. So it's really interesting to see how there is a deficit for nighttime activity, for nighttime spaces, also for affordable ones, as young people need to meet and need to concentrate and need to congregate somewhere, but sometimes cities like Barcelona are too expensive for them. So what happened? So in this case, the project that I was responsible for doing had to do with helping the city of Barcelona design a nighttime vision to help articulate some of the ideas that the Taula Ciudadana was discussing. And we did, again, participatory workshops with these 4 groups and creating new spaces for dialogue, for collaboration. And we identified what kinds of interests these groups had, because they had like very marked agendas and very different agendas. But you can see they all congregate in the center. If you look at the image in the bottom, although each of these groups had very different interests, in the end, they all wanted a safer Barcelona. They wanted a Barcelona that has a more diverse and deconcentrated nightlife offer, a city that has that not only favors tourism, but also local interests. So in the end, this paved the way for creating a vision for the city at night. But although the city has made a lot of progress, there's still a lot of work to be done. And this is what's happening now. I don't know if you've seen this in the news, but the city has been installing sound meters. And the reason for this is that in a city like Barcelona, noise is one of the biggest problems. And apparently, well, not apparently, according to studies, 57% of residents are exposed to higher noise levels than those that are healthy by the considered by the World Health Organization, which is 45 dB at night. And most of this problem, or almost 20% of this problem, is attributed to nightlife or entertainment uses. The rest is mostly the traffic. And in order to respond to this problem, what the city has done is to identify nighttime acoustically saturated areas. And when they identify these areas, then some measures follow. If an area is determined acoustically saturated, then that means that terraces that are in the area must close an hour earlier at 11. And then all those plans that were laid out during the pandemic, like using public spaces, using sidewalks for cafes, for outdoor use, they're gone. So if there is an acoustically saturated area, that means that there's more restrictions. So that's what the city of Barcelona is doing. What's happening? I'm not going to say if this is good or bad. I'm not going to get into politics, but basically this is pointing to one side of the coin. What's happening on one hand is that we're looking at some regulations to respond to a problem, but there needs to be more work done in terms of how to articulate the other interests. So we have a shared vision that doesn't kill nightlife in the city of Barcelona. And this is an article that my friend Angela here sent to me a few days ago, which basically is an irony that Barcelona, one of the bars in Barcelona, El Paradiso, was just named the best bar in the world. But the city, as I mentioned before, has lost all these other spaces. So how can we find this balance and remove these tensions by allowing people to sleep, but also by having a city that is a global city that attracts people and that its nightlife is a staple of its, is a staple and a pull factor. And just to finalize, basically, the way of doing this is by putting together a strategy, by understanding that this involves a vision, an inventory or map, performing cost-benefit analysis, designing a nighttime governance model, updating local policies, and also testing different ways of doing this by doing pilot interventions and experiments. So to wrap up, why should cities care about nighttime governance? Because it provides opportunities for local economic development, because it creates space, diverse spaces for socialization, because it's new platforms to showcase culture, to showcase heritage, because safer and vibrant streets make cities and residents feel better, and also because sustainable and productive environments enable work and leisure. It's important also to understand, this is another topic for another lecture perhaps, but the climate crisis doesn't end at 6 p.m. And this is something that was said today in a talk that I was before coming here. And it's really important to think about how nighttime ecosystems have an impact on the environment. And part of studying and understanding nighttime governance is measuring these impacts and doing something about it. Just to give you a sense of how much this has grown, and I don't know why this is making this noise. Yeah, I'm almost done. So I just wanted to leave you with the message that this is a. Can you hear me well? This is weird, no? Let's try with the last one. Okay. Gracias. Just wanted to leave you inspired and see how places like the US, look at how many, this was shared by the Responsible Hospitality Institute this week. Look just in the US, how many cities are planning or have already a nighttime office. It's crazy. It's popping up everywhere. So there's tons of opportunities of cities getting involved in planning their nights in a more proactive way. And also there's many networks that have been emerging around the world, and here in Spain and in Europe, there's many key actors, and here I wanted to share just some references, like the International Conference on Night Studies, which is a very interesting way of getting involved, of knowing more about these studies. The Madrid International Night Conference that happened for the first time this year, the Nights Conference, which happened also this year, and the 24-Hour Cities Network that was created by MasterCard, but now this community of experts, of activists, of people who study the night will migrate to IAAC very soon, and we will continue conversations virtually with people in these topics. And finally, also to recognize some local actors such as Comisión Nocturna, which is a local commission that articulates clubs and nighttime venues in the city of Barcelona. There's a similar organization, also NIX in Madrid, and then Vibe Lab, which is this consultancy that I've been collaborating with. These are some of the actors that have been playing a role in nighttime planning. And I just wanted to share this with you so you get a sense of how this is a topic that is growing and that there's more and more opportunities to become involved in a field like this. So I hope you do get interested, and so carpe noctem.